The morning sun glinted off Detective Ray Daniels' badge as he pinned it to his chest, a daily ritual he performed for 15 years. He stood in front of his bathroom mirror, admiring how the gold shield caught the light. At 43, his face showed the wear of late nights and early mornings, but his eyes still burned with the same intensity they had when he first joined the force. Another day, another criminal off the streets, he muttered to himself, straightening his tie. The confidence in his voice wasn't new. It had grown steadily over the years, nurtured by an impressive string of arrests and convictions that had earned him both promotions and a reputation. Ray walked through the precinct doors like he owned the place. Junior officers nodded respectfully as he passed. The captain gave him a thumbs up from across the room. Even the desk sergeant, a grumpy old-timer who rarely showed approval for anyone, grunted what passed for a greeting. "Got something good for me today?" Ray asked, dropping into his desk chair and taking a sip from his coffee. His partner Tom looked up from his computer. "Maybe. Got a tip about that jewelry store robbery from last month." "Let me guess, not enough evidence," Ray said with a knowing smile. Tom shrugged. "That's where your magic comes in, isn't it?" There had been a time when Ray did everything by the book. Fresh out of the academy, he believed in the system, but after watching guilty people walk free on technicalities, something had shifted inside him. At first, it was just small things, a report written after the fact, a witness statement polished to sound more certain. Nothing major, he told himself, just helping justice along. That afternoon, Ray sat across from a nervous-looking man in interrogation room 3. The suspect kept glancing at the door as if planning an escape. "We know you were there, Pete," Ray said, spreading photos across the table. "Your car was seen 2 blocks away. A witness places someone matching your description near the scene." None of this was exactly true. They had a blurry traffic cam image of a similar vehicle and a witness description that could match half the men in the city. But Pete didn't know that. "I want a lawyer," Pete stammered. Ray leaned back in his chair. "Sure thing. We'll get you a lawyer, and while we wait, we'll get a warrant for your apartment. Your girlfriend's place too. That's where you stash the goods, right? She'll be an accessory. Shame. I heard she just got that nursing job she wanted." The color drained from Pete's face. "Leave her out of this. She didn't do anything." 2 hours later, Ray walked out with a signed confession. By evening, he was accepting congratulations from the captain. No one asked too many questions about how he'd gotten the confession. Results were what mattered. That night, at O'Malley's bar, the usual crowd of cops gathered to celebrate another case closed. Ray sat at the center, holding court like a king among his subjects. To Ray, someone called out, raising a glass. "The man who always gets his guy." Ray smiled as he took a drink, enjoying the warmth of their approval. Each success reinforced his belief that he was doing what needed to be done. The system was flawed, but he wasn't. His methods got results, and in his mind, that justified everything. At home later, Ray added another newspaper clipping to his collection, another headline celebrating his work. He didn't notice how the headlines had subtly changed over the years, from "Detective solves complex case" to "Controversial detective gets another conviction." The distinction wouldn't have bothered him anyway. In his mind, the ends justified the means. As he drifted off to sleep, his badge sat on his nightstand, catching the moonlight streaming through the window. To Ray, it wasn't just a symbol of authority. It was a shield that protected him from consequences, a golden ticket that let him operate above the rules that constrained others. What he couldn't see was that shields, no matter how strong, eventually crack under pressure. And someone was about to apply more pressure than Ray Daniels had ever faced before. The rain fell in sheets, turning the city streets into rivers of reflected neon. Detective Ray Daniels hunched his shoulders against the downpour as he approached the apartment building. This case had been giving him headaches for weeks, a string of break-ins that had the higher-ups breathing down his neck. 3 months with no solid leads, and the pressure was mounting. "This better pan out," his partner Tom grumbled, wiping rain from his face. Ray nodded. "Trust me, my informant says she's good for it." The tip had come in that morning, someone claiming that Elena Rodriguez was connected to the robberies. The evidence was thin, barely enough for a search warrant, but Ray wasn't concerned with details. Elena Rodriguez was a public defender, and Ray had crossed paths with her in court before. She'd torn apart his testimony last year, getting one of his arrests thrown out. He hadn't forgotten the humiliation. The building's security door was broken, hanging slightly ajar. Ray exchanged a look with Tom before pushing it open. "Convenient," Tom said. Ray shrugged. "Lucky break." They made their way to apartment 3B. Ray knocked loudly, announcing police, with authority in his voice. When Elena opened the door, her expression shifted from confusion to recognition to wariness in the space of seconds. At 32, she carried herself with the confidence of someone who knew the law inside and out. "Detective Daniels," she said coolly, "what can I help you with?" "We have a warrant to search your apartment," Ray said, holding up the document. "Step aside, please." Elena took the warrant, scanning it quickly with practiced eyes. "This is regarding the West Side break-ins. You can't seriously think I'm involved." "We go where the evidence leads us," Ray replied, pushing past her into the apartment. The search was thorough and destructive. Ray made sure of it, pulling books from shelves, emptying drawers onto the floor. Elena watched with growing anger. "This is harassment, and you know it," she said. Ray ignored her, moving to the bedroom. That's when he found it, a small jewelry box tucked in the back of her closet, containing items matching descriptions from the robberies. Elena's face paled when he held it up. "That's not mine," she said firmly. "Someone put that there." Ray smiled coldly. "Yeah, we hear that a lot." As Tom read Elena her rights, Ray caught a flash of something in her eyes. Not just anger or shock, but understanding. In that moment, he felt a flicker of unease. Unlike his usual suspects, Elena knew exactly how the system worked. She knew its weaknesses because she exploited them every day on behalf of her clients. The ride to the station was quiet. In the rearview mirror, Ray watched Elena sitting calmly in the back seat, her gaze steady despite the handcuffs. Most people fell apart when arrested. They cried, they begged, they bargained. Elena did none of these things. At the station, Ray went through the booking process with satisfaction. Fingerprinting, mugshots, paperwork, each step cementing her fall. When he escorted her to the holding cell, he couldn't resist a comment. "Not so easy being on this side of the bars, is it, counselor?" Elena looked at him with clear eyes. "You planted that evidence, Ray. We both know it." "Prove it," he replied with a smirk. "I will," she said quietly. "And when I do, that badge won't protect you." Ray laughed it off, but her words followed him through the rest of his shift. By evening, word had spread through the precinct about the arrest. His captain clapped him on the shoulder. "Good work bringing in a suspect on the West Side case," he said. "Though a public defender, that's going to bring scrutiny." "The evidence is solid," Ray insisted. "It'll stick." Later that night, as Ray filed his report, he made sure to smooth over the rough edges. The anonymous tip became a confidential informant with previous reliability. The broken security door became entry gained after announcement. The jewelry just happened to be in plain view during the lawful search. The paperwork told a clean story, like all his reports did. As he drove home that night, rain still falling on the windshield, Ray pushed away any lingering doubts. He had arrested hundreds of people who claimed innocence. Elena Rodriguez was just another suspect, her legal knowledge nothing more than an inconvenience. What Ray didn't realize was that he'd just made the biggest mistake of his career. Because Elena wasn't just any suspect. And unlike the others, she wouldn't go quietly into the system that Ray had manipulated for years. She was about to become the one thing Ray had never truly faced, a worthy opponent who understood the game better than he did. The concrete walls of the county jail seemed to press in from all sides. Elena Rodriguez sat on the thin mattress of her cell, watching the shadows move across the floor as the day passed. 3 weeks had gone by since Detective Ray Daniels had arrested her. 3 weeks of orange jumpsuits, scheduled meals, and the constant noise of a place where privacy didn't exist. "Rodriguez, you've got a visitor," a guard called, unlocking her cell door. In the visitation room, her colleague Diane waited, legal pad ready and concern written across her face. "How are you holding up?" Diane asked once they were seated. Elena pushed a strand of hair behind her ear. "I'm managing. Any news on the bail hearing?" "It's set for tomorrow. The DA is fighting it, claiming you're a flight risk because of your connections to the legal system." Elena shook her head. "Of course they are. Ray's gotten to them." She leaned forward, lowering her voice. "I need you to do something for me. Check Ray Daniels' arrest record for the past 5 years. Look for patterns. Cases with evidence that appeared at the last minute, witnesses who changed their stories after talking to him." Diane raised an eyebrow. "You think he's done this before?" "I know he has," Elena said firmly. "Men like Ray don't just wake up one day and decide to plant evidence. It starts small and builds over time. He's gotten away with it for years because most of his targets can't fight back effectively." As Diane jotted notes, Elena continued, "And I need you to get me copies of the police logs from the day of my arrest. I want to know exactly when Ray requested that search warrant and who signed off on it." Back in her cell later that day, Elena started a journal, documenting everything she could remember about her arrest. The way Ray had seemed to know exactly where to find the planted jewelry. The convenient broken security door that would have given him access to her apartment before she arrived home. The smirk on his face when he booked her. "Day 23, she wrote. "The food here is as bad as my clients always said. Makes me think about how many of them told me about evidence appearing out of nowhere during searches. I should have listened more carefully." At night, Elena lay awake, listening to the sounds of the jail. A woman crying softly in a nearby cell. Guards making their rounds. The occasional shout or argument. Her life had been upended in a single day. Her reputation was in tatters. The local paper had run her mugshot with the headline, "Public DFNDR AREST in break-in STPRE." Her neighbors probably believed it. Most people would. But unlike many who found themselves behind bars unjustly, Elena had advantages. She knew how the system worked. She understood its weaknesses and its pressure points. And most importantly, she wasn't alone. The next day, in court for her bail hearing, Elena sat straight-backed beside her lawyer. Across the room, Ray Daniels watched with cold eyes as she was finally granted bail, $50,000, an amount her colleagues had pooled together to cover. As she walked out of the courtroom, Ray stepped into her path. "Enjoy your freedom while it lasts," he said quietly. "The trial won't go your way." Elena met his gaze steadily. "You know, the interesting thing about corruption, detective, is that it leaves a trail. You might be good at covering your tracks, but nobody's perfect." Something flickered across Ray's face, the faintest hint of uncertainty. Later that evening, Elena walked into her apartment for the first time in weeks. It was still a mess from the search, books scattered across the floor, drawers emptied, clothes thrown about. A violation that went beyond the physical. She picked up a framed photo of herself at law school graduation. 8 years of defending others, and now she needed to defend herself. She set the photo down and pulled out her phone. "Deanne? It's me. Did you find anything on those cases I asked about?" Diane's voice crackled through the speaker. "More than I expected. I've got at least 12 cases with the same pattern. And that's just from a preliminary search. And the warrant timing." "That's even more interesting," Diane replied. "Ray requested the search warrant for your place at 9:15 a.m., but cell tower data places his car near your apartment at 7:30 that morning. 2 hours unaccounted for." Elena felt a surge of cold determination. "That's what I thought. He needed time to plant the evidence." She walked to her kitchen table and spread out blank papers. It was time to build her case, not just to defend herself, but to expose Ray Daniels. As she started to write, making notes and connecting dots, she thought about all the people who had faced Ray's corruption without her advantages. People who had lost years of their lives because they couldn't fight back. "This isn't just about me anymore," she whispered to the empty apartment. Outside her window, the city lights flickered on as darkness fell. Somewhere out there, Ray Daniels was probably celebrating another successful day, secure in his power, confident in his badge. He had no idea that the woman he'd tried to silence was methodically laying the groundwork to bring him down. And unlike his other victims, Elena Rodriguez knew exactly how to do it. The office lights burned late into the night as Diane hunched over stacks of case files. Coffee cups piled up beside her desk, testimony to the long hours she'd been working. Outside, the city slept, but inside this small law office, a different kind of justice was taking shape. "I found another one," she said, pushing a file across the desk to Elena. "Guy named Carlos Rivera. Arrested by Ray 3 years ago for armed robbery. Evidence appeared during a search of his apartment, a mask and a gun that matched the description from the robbery. Elena took the file, flipping through it with practiced eyes. Let me guess, Rivers swore the items weren't his. Exactly. Said he'd never seen them before. Nobody believed him, of course. He's still serving 7 years. Elena added the file to a growing pile. Over the past 2 weeks, they'd identified 23 cases with the same pattern. Detective Ray Daniels making arrests where evidence materialized in suspicious circumstances. Most victims were people with previous records, easy to discredit, easy to convict. We need to talk to Internal Affairs, Elena said, rubbing her tired eyes. You think they'll listen? Ray's a decorated detective. We're talking about bringing down one of their own. Elena nodded grimly. That's why we need to make our case airtight. Get Rivera's family on the phone tomorrow. I want statements from everyone who claimed Ray planted evidence. The next morning, Elena walked into the police headquarters, back straight despite the stares that followed her. The receptionist recognized her immediately. Ms. Rodriguez? What are you doing here? I have an appointment with Lieutenant Garcia in Internal Affairs, Elena replied calmly. The wait was deliberate, designed to make her uncomfortable. 45 minutes on a hard plastic chair while officers walked by, some openly staring, others pretending not to notice. Finally, a door opened. Ms. Rodriguez? Come in. Lieutenant Garcia was a heavy-set man with 25 years on the force. His office walls were covered with commendations and photos of him shaking hands with city officials. He didn't offer Elena a seat. You've made some serious allegations against Detective Daniels, he said without preamble. I hope you understand the gravity of falsely accusing an officer. I understand the gravity of an officer planting evidence and sending innocent people to prison, Elena countered, placing a thick folder on his desk. 23 cases, Lieutenant, all with the same pattern. Garcia barely glanced at the folder. Criminals claiming innocence isn't exactly new, counselor. Cell tower data placing Ray near my apartment 2 hours before he officially requested a search warrant isn't just a claim, Elena pushed. That's evidence, as is the testimony I've gathered from multiple defendants. For nearly an hour, Elena laid out her case. Dates, times, witness statements. With each point, Garcia's expression hardened. I'll look into it, he finally said, closing the folder. Don't expect much. Elena hadn't expected much, but the dismissal still stung. As she walked out of the station, she spotted Ray in the parking lot, laughing with another officer. He saw her too, his smile fading into a sneer. That evening, Elena's phone rang. An unknown number. Hello. Is this Elena Rodriguez? A woman's voice, tentative. Yes, who's calling? My name is Lucia Vega. I'm a reporter with the City Times. I've been working on a story about possible misconduct in the police department. A pause. Your name came up. Elena's heart raced. I'm listening. I've been tracking similar cases for months, Lucia continued. Officers with unusually high conviction rates, evidence that appears conveniently, witnesses who change their stories after police interviews. When I heard about your case, it fit the pattern. They agreed to meet the next day at a small cafe far from the police station. Lucia arrived first, a slim woman with alert eyes that missed nothing. She had a notebook already open on the table. Thank you for meeting me, she said as Elena sat down. This isn't easy, going against the police. No, it isn't, Elena agreed. But someone has to. For 2 hours, they compared notes. Lucia had been investigating police misconduct for 18 months, gathering stories that never made it to print because victims were too afraid to go on record or editors deemed the evidence too circumstantial. People don't want to believe the police can be corrupt, Lucia explained. It's easier to believe criminals are lying. But if we combine my evidence with your research, Elena began, we might have enough to break through the blue wall, Lucia finished. That night, Elena couldn't sleep. Her trial date was approaching, but now she had something Ray didn't, allies. Diane was gathering more evidence from past cases. Lucia was prepared to put the weight of the press behind the story, and the victims of Ray's corruption were starting to find their voices. She walked to her window, looking out at the city lights. Somewhere out there, Ray Daniels was probably sleeping soundly, confident in his badge, sure that the system would protect him as it always had. Not this time, Elena whispered to the darkness. The next morning, her phone rang again. It was Diane, her voice urgent. Elena, you need to see this. Another victim of Ray's just came forward, and he has proof, an actual recording of Ray threatening him during interrogation. Elena's pulse quickened. Send it to me. And call Lucia. Tell her the wall is starting to crack. The blue line that had protected Ray for so long was about to face something it couldn't intimidate or silence. The truth. The district attorney's office was housed in a gray stone building that loomed over the courthouse steps. Elena took a deep breath before pushing through the heavy wooden doors. Inside, the air smelled of old paper and furniture polish. A receptionist looked up as she approached. I'm here to see District Attorney Wilson, Elena said, her voice steady despite the butterflies in her stomach. Do you have an appointment? No, but he'll want to hear what I have to say. 15 minutes later, Elena sat across from DA Frank Wilson, a man with thinning hair and eyes that had seen it all in 30 years of prosecuting cases. His office walls were lined with law books and framed newspaper clippings of his biggest wins. Ms. Rodriguez, he said, folding his hands on his desk. This is unusual. You're currently facing charges filed by my office, yet you're here without your attorney. I'm here because I have evidence that Detective Ray Daniels has been planting evidence and falsifying reports for years, Elena replied, placing a USB drive on his desk, including in my case. Wilson's expression didn't change, but his eyes flicked to the drive. That's a serious accusation. Listen to the recording on that drive. Miguel Ortiz, arrested by Ray 2 years ago. Ray didn't know Ortiz was recording their conversation on his phone. You can clearly hear Ray threatening to plant drugs in his apartment if he didn't confess to a robbery. Wilson picked up the drive but didn't plug it in. And you expect me to what? Drop the charges against you based on an alleged recording that could have been doctored. I expect you to investigate, Elena said firmly. I've identified 27 cases with the same pattern. 27 lives ruined. And Lucia Vega at the City Times is preparing a story on police misconduct that prominently features Ray Daniels. At the mention of the newspaper, Wilson's poker face slipped. The press doesn't dictate how this office operates. No, but it can shine a very uncomfortable light on it, Elena countered. Listen to the recording, look at the evidence, then decide if you want to be remembered as the DA who protected a corrupt cop or the one who had the courage to admit a mistake. As Elena walked down the courthouse steps 30 minutes later, her phone buzzed with a text from Diane. How did it go? She typed back, he listened. That's a start. Back at her apartment, Elena found Lucia waiting for her, laptop open on the kitchen table. I got statements from 3 more of Ray's victims, Lucia said without looking up. All willing to go on record now. Elena dropped her bag and sat down heavily. Good. Wilson's considering the evidence. He's worried about the publicity. As he should be, Lucia replied, turning her laptop to show Elena a draft of her article. The headline read, BADG of DISHONOR, Detectives PATEON of CORUTION exposed. When will this run? Elena asked. 3 days. My editor wants legal to review it thoroughly first. Elena nodded. Just in time for my pretrial hearing. Later that evening, as Elena was reviewing case notes, her doorbell rang. Through the peephole, she saw 2 men in suits. Not Ray, but cops nonetheless. She could tell by their stance. She opened the door cautiously. Ms. Rodriguez, I'm Detective Powell. This is Detective Walsh, Internal Affairs. For the next 2 hours, the IA detectives asked detailed questions about Ray's conduct, her evidence, the other cases she'd identified. They revealed little about their own investigation, but took copious notes. As they were leaving, Detective Powell paused. For what it's worth, Lieutenant Garcia has been removed from your complaint. Conflict of interest. He and Daniels go way back. I figured as much, Elena replied. We're taking this seriously, Ms. Rodriguez, Powell added. That's all I can say for now. After they left, Elena called Diane. I just left. I think they're actually investigating, she said, the first hint of hope in her voice in weeks. About time, Diane replied. Listen, I've been thinking. The DA offered you a plea deal last week. Probation, no jail time. Maybe you should consider it. Elena sat up straight. What? No. Accepting a plea would mean admitting guilt. It would mean Ray wins. But you could move on with your life. No risk of conviction, no prison time. And what about the 27 other people Ray has done this to? What about the ones still in prison based on his lies? I can't walk away from this, Diane. The morning of the pretrial hearing dawned bright and clear. Elena dressed carefully in her best suit, the one she normally reserved for high-profile cases. Today, she was both lawyer and defendant, a strange duality. At the courthouse, reporters clustered on the steps. Lucia had published her article that morning, and the story had spread quickly. Camera flashes popped as Elena walked past. Inside, the courtroom was packed. Elena spotted Diane and other colleagues from the public defender's office. In the back row sat several people she recognized from her investigation, other victims of Ray's misconduct, there to show support. And then Ray himself walked in, accompanied by his lawyer. He looked thinner than she remembered, with dark circles under his eyes. Their eyes met briefly, and for the first time, Elena saw something new in his gaze: uncertainty. The prosecutor approached her before the judge entered. Ms. Rodriguez, in light of new evidence, we'd like to discuss the possibility of dismissing the charges. Elena stood her ground. I'm not interested in a quiet dismissal. I want an acknowledgement on the record that Detective Daniels falsified evidence. The prosecutor lowered his voice. That's not how this works. We can make this go away cleanly. No, Elena said firmly. This has never been about just me. I'll see you before the judge. As the bailiff called the court to order, Elena took her place at the defense table, back straight, eyes forward. The moment she had been preparing for had arrived. The case against her was about to become the case against Detective Ray Daniels, and nothing would ever be the same again. The courtroom fell silent as Judge Patricia Lynn entered, her black robes flowing behind her. Elena could feel the weight of dozens of eyes on her back, reporters, colleagues, Ray's fellow officers, and the growing number of his victims who had come to witness this moment. Case number 2187, State versus Rodriguez, the clerk announced. Elena's attorney, a veteran defense lawyer named Michael Chen, stood beside her. He'd joined her case pro bono after learning about the evidence against Ray. Across the aisle, the prosecutor shuffled papers nervously. And at the back of the courtroom, Ray Daniels sat with his own lawyer, his usual confidence noticeably diminished. Your Honor, the prosecutor began, in light of new evidence that has come to our attention, the state requests a 2-week continuance to review the materials. Judge Lynn peered over her reading glasses. That's an unusual request at this stage, Counselor. What new evidence? Michael stepped forward. Your Honor, we've uncovered substantial proof that Detective Ray Daniels falsified evidence in this case. Not only that, but we've identified a pattern of similar misconduct spanning years. The judge's gaze sharpened. That's a serious allegation, Mr. Chen. One we're prepared to prove today, Michael replied. We request the opportunity to present this evidence and call Detective Daniels to testify. A murmur swept through the courtroom. The prosecutor leaned over to whisper urgently with his assistant. Ray's lawyer stood up. Your Honor, this is highly irregular. My client isn't on trial here. Perhaps he should be, Judge Lynn replied coolly. I'll hear the evidence. For the next hour, Michael methodically presented their case. The cell tower data showing Ray near Elena's apartment hours before obtaining a search warrant. The audio recording of Ray threatening another suspect. Testimony from 3 of Ray's previous victims, each describing how evidence had mysteriously appeared during searches. Throughout it all, Elena watched Ray's face. The dismissive smirk he'd worn at the beginning had long since vanished, replaced by a tightness around his eyes that spoke of growing fear. And finally, Your Honor, Michael said, we call Detective Ray Daniels to the stand. The courtroom hushed as Ray walked to the witness box. He straightened his tie, a gesture Elena had seen many times during other trials when he'd been the one presenting evidence, confident in his badge and the system that had always backed him. After being sworn in, Ray sat with his hands folded, meeting Michael's gaze steadily. Detective Daniels, Michael began, could you walk us through the events leading to Ms. Rodriguez's arrest? Ray recited his story smoothly, the version from his police report. An anonymous tip. A proper search warrant. the discovery of stolen jewelry hidden in Elena's closet. And you had no previous contact with Ms. Rodriguez before this arrest? Michael asked. We'd crossed paths in court, Ray replied cautiously. In fact, she had successfully challenged your testimony in the State versus Williams case last year, hadn't she? Resulting in evidence being thrown out. A muscle twitched in Ray's jaw. That's correct. Detective, are you familiar with a man named Miguel Ortiz? Ray hesitated. I've arrested many people. The name doesn't ring a bell. Michael approached the bench, holding a cell phone. Your Honor, I'd like to play an audio recording. The judge nodded, and the courtroom speakers crackled to life. Listen to me, Ortiz. Ray's voice filled the room, unmistakable despite the recording's quality. You've got two choices. Confess to the robbery now, or I swear I'll find something in your apartment that'll put you away for 20 years. Your choice. Your prints on the gun, or your signature on this confession. The color drained from Ray's face as his own voice condemned him. In the gallery, Elena could hear the soft gasps of shock, even from some of the officers present. Detective Daniels, Michael continued after the recording ended, would you like to revise your earlier testimony? Ray looked toward his lawyer, who gave a slight nod. I'd like to speak with my attorney, Ray said, his voice suddenly hoarse. Judge Lynn called a 15-minute recess. The courtroom buzzed with conversation as Ray huddled with his lawyer in intense discussion. Elena remained at the defense table, her heart pounding but her face composed. When court resumed, Ray returned to the stand. His shoulders had a defeated slump that Elena had never seen before. Detective Daniels, Michael asked, did you plant evidence in Ms. Rodriguez's apartment? The courtroom held its collective breath. Yes, Ray finally said, barely audible. Please speak up for the record, Judge Lynn instructed. Ray cleared his throat. Yes, I planted the evidence. And was this the first time you've done so? Ray's eyes darted around the courtroom, landing briefly on the faces of his fellow officers, some confused, others angry, a few looking away in shame. No, he admitted, it wasn't the first time. By the time Michael finished his questioning, Ray had admitted to falsifying evidence in at least 7 cases, including Elena's. His voice grew more mechanical with each admission, as if he were talking about someone else's crimes. When he finally stepped down from the witness stand, Ray looked like a different man, smaller somehow, the authority that had defined him stripped away by his own words. Judge Lynn's voice cut through the stunned silence. This hearing is now concluded. Ms. Rodriguez, all charges against you are dismissed with prejudice. She turned her stern gaze to the prosecutor. And I expect your office to launch an immediate review of all cases involving Detective Daniels. Detective, you are remanded into custody pending charges of evidence tampering, perjury, and civil rights violations. As the bailiff approached Ray with handcuffs, the very tools he had used on so many others, he finally looked directly at Elena. In that brief moment of eye contact, something passed between them, an acknowledgement, perhaps, that the system he had manipulated for so long had finally caught up with him. Elena watched as they led Ray away, not with satisfaction, but with a quiet sense of justice beginning to unfold. The badge he had believed made him invincible now lay metaphorically shattered at his feet. 6 months had passed since that day in court when Ray Daniels admitted to planting evidence. The cherry trees were blooming outside the courthouse, their petals drifting down like pink snow as Elena walked up the familiar steps. Today was Ray's sentencing hearing, the culmination of a case that had shaken the city's criminal justice system to its core. Inside, the courtroom was even more crowded than it had been during Elena's hearing. News of Ray's corruption had spread far beyond their city, picked up by national media outlets as part of a larger conversation about police accountability. Camera crews waited outside, but Judge Lynn had banned them from the courtroom itself. Elena slipped into a seat near the back. She wasn't there to testify today. She had already given her statement to the court. She was there to witness the final chapter of a story that had consumed her life for nearly a year. The door opened, and Ray entered in an orange jumpsuit, handcuffed and escorted by 2 officers. His hair had grown longer during his time in jail, and he'd lost weight. His eyes swept the courtroom, pausing briefly when he spotted Elena. There was no anger in his gaze now, just a weary resignation. Once the proceedings began, the prosecutor outlined the case against Ray. 12 counts of evidence tampering, 8 counts of perjury, 15 civil rights violations. In the months since Ray's confession, a task force had reviewed all of his cases, uncovering a pattern of misconduct stretching back nearly 7 years. The defendant didn't just break the law, the prosecutor concluded. He broke the public trust placed in him as an officer of the law. He stole years from innocent people's lives, and he did it all while hiding behind his badge. Ray's defense attorney spoke next, highlighting Ray's years of service before his misconduct began, citing the pressures of the job, the push for results in a department where conviction rates determined promotions. "My client has accepted responsibility for his actions," the lawyer said. He cooperated fully with the investigation, which has led to the exoneration of 17 wrongfully convicted individuals. When it was Ray's turn to speak, he stood slowly, the chains around his wrists jangling in the quiet courtroom. "I've had a lot of time to think," he began, his voice rougher than Elena remembered, "about where it all went wrong. It started small. A piece of evidence moved to be more visible during a search. A witness statement cleaned up to sound more certain. I told myself I was just helping justice along." He paused, swallowing hard. "But that's not what happened. I became the very thing I once swore to fight against. I caused harm to people who didn't deserve it. I can't undo that harm. I can't give back the years that people lost because of me." His eyes found Elena again. "Ms. Rodriguez wasn't my first victim, but she was the one who finally stopped me. For that, I'm grateful. Not now, maybe, but someday I will be." Judge Lynn sentenced Ray to 15 years in prison, with the possibility of parole after 8. As the bailiffs led him away, Elena felt no triumph, just a quiet sense that something broken had begun to heal. Outside, reporters swarmed around her. "Ms. Rodriguez, how do you feel about the sentence? Is justice being served?" Elena paused before answering. This was never just about one corrupt officer. This was about a system that protected him, that looked the other way, that valued convictions over truth. Today is a step forward, but there's still a long way to go. That evening, Elena sat in her office at the Justice Reform Project, the nonprofit she had founded with the settlement money from her wrongful arrest lawsuit. The walls were covered with photos of people who had been exonerated after Ray's downfall, 17 faces so far, with more cases still under review. Her phone rang, Diane calling from the courthouse. "The Parker case just wrapped up," Diane said. "Conviction overturned. He'll be released tomorrow morning after 6 years inside." "I'll be there," Elena replied, making a note on her calendar. After hanging up, she walked to the window. The city stretched out before her, lights blinking on as dusk fell. Somewhere out there, Ray Daniels was beginning his first night of a 15-year sentence. And somewhere else, a man named Parker was preparing to spend his last night behind bars before tasting freedom again. The door opened and Lucia stepped in, holding a newspaper. "Hot off the press," she said, laying it on Elena's desk. The headline read, "Police Department ANNOUNCES SNVEPLAND REFOIMS ANWAKOFDANELCASA." "It's actually happening," Lucia said, a hint of wonder in her voice. "Independent Oversight Board. Body cameras for all officers. New procedures for evidence handling. All the things you've been pushing for." Elena picked up the paper, scanning the details. "It's a start," she said, "not an ending, but a beginning." Later that night, as she drove home, Elena passed the police station where it had all begun nearly a year ago. The building looked the same, but what happened inside was slowly changing. Not fast enough, not completely, but changing nonetheless. She thought about Ray, about the moment in court when the facade had finally cracked, when he'd admitted what he'd done. Not just to her, but to all the others. She thought about the system that had enabled him, the blind eyes turned, the warnings ignored. And she thought about the work still to be done. Her phone buzzed with a text. A thank you message from the mother of one of Ray's victims, a young man who would be released next week after a 5-year wrongful imprisonment. This isn't the end, Elena whispered to herself as she drove toward home, toward tomorrow, toward whatever came next. This is just the beginning.